Okay, welcome to Psych 235, Child Psychology. We're on Chapter 11, Middle Childhood, basically ages 6 to about 11. And something that's important during this time, of course, is school achievement. So we're going to talk about tests today, basically, and aptitude tests, IQ tests, achievement tests. What do you do with the kids that are a bit behind? How do you know if somebody's behind, let's say, in their achievement, or if there's a learning disability or something like that? What do you do with the gifted kids? There'll be a little bit about that at the end. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's actually an interesting part of the chapter. Okay, we're on chapter 11, the second half. Okay, so measuring the mind. Okay, so we need to distinguish between what we mean by aptitude, okay, and IQ, and well, then what an achievement test is. So aptitude is the potential basically to master a specific skill or to learn a certain body of language. Okay, your aptitude, okay, your potential to master something. An IQ test is designed to measure what we call intellectual aptitude. To put it bluntly, IQ tests were designed to measure intelligence, which is a kind of aptitude. Okay, an IQ test. So the term IQ, which stands for intelligent quotient, okay, was at first defined as your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. That's the way it was first defined. I will tell you that nowadays, that's no longer I mean, it's still kind of defined that way, but it's not calculated with a simple, just by simply dividing your chronological age, your mental age by your chronological age. And now they actually compare your score to how other people of similar age scored and determine where you're at, where you're above or below the average. If you're above the average, you have an IQ above 100. If you're below it, you have an IQ below 100. If you're right in the middle, then your IQ would be about 100. Okay, but that's your IQ. It's supposed to measure your intelligence. And I know that's a bit controversial, and we'll talk about why it is controversial. Okay, an achievement test is a test that's designed to measure mastery of some subject, maybe proficiency, let's say how proficient you are in reading, so how good you are at reading, or maybe in math, in writing, science, or some other subject. An achievement test basically is really designed to measure, school achievement, how well you're doing in certain subjects. An IQ test, on the other hand, is supposed to measure your overall intelligence, okay, your kind of general intelligence. All right, let's keep going. I want to tell you something about IQ tests in general. There's something known as the Flint Effect. The Flint Effect refers to a rise in the average IQ scores that have occurred over decades in many nations, okay? So the Flint Effect is basically the fact that IQ scores seem to be rising, okay? Does that actually mean we're getting more intelligent? Right? As a species, the human beings getting more intelligent, or are people just getting better at taking the tests? Do the tests actually measure intelligence? Maybe they're just measuring knowledge. And nowadays we have knowledge more readily available. We have the internet. We have basically, believe it or not, our education has gotten better despite the complaints and stuff like that. It is better than it used to be decades ago or 100 years ago. It is. What is really going on? Some say that this Flint Effect, the fact that IQ scores have been rising, and not just over the last couple of decades, they've been rising for a long time. Okay, I don't know exactly how long, but maybe 50 years or something like that. They have been rising. Okay, if you were to compare what, let's say a child today that's 10 years old knows compared to a child that was 10 years old 50 years ago, today's child would know a lot more and would therefore probably score better on the IQ test. Does that mean that the child is smarter? Not necessarily. So a lot of people say that, well, this is basically proof that IQ tests don't really measure intelligence. They just measure knowledge. That's all they're measuring. The knowledge you're supposed to have gained as a member of this culture. Knowledge you're supposed to have gained basically because you go to school, or because you are an American, you're a member of this culture. Okay. If we want to compare scores, right, we have to look at something called, the distribution of scores. This is also referred to as, the bell curve, okay? I do know that there is a book called The Bell Curve that is about intelligence. It's very controversial, that makes some claims about, some people being better than others and that it's genetic and stuff like that. Very controversial book. Here, I'm just talking about the distribution of scores, and they tend to align themselves along a bell-shaped curve, and that's where the title of that book comes from, by the way. When you give the IQ test to a bunch of people and you graph the scores, they will look like this. So the average IQ is 100. That's right in the middle. So if you look at the horizontal numbers over here, the horizontal line, the numbers there, 100 is right in the middle. And if you can see all the way to the top of the curve, that is where the curve rises to the highest point. 100 is the average. And see that color there, that light color, that I'm not sure what is that, light gray or light blue. It basically says between IQ scores between 85 and 115 are classified as average. So if your IQ is 85, between 85 and 115, you are average. You have your average intelligence is what this says, okay? Those below 100 a little bit less than average, those above 100 a little bit more than average, but you're right around the average, about 68.26%. You see that number there, right above 100. That's about the percentage of people who score in that range. So more than 2 out of every 3 individuals score in that range. If you go to the higher end, if your IQ is between 115 and 130, then you're smarter than average. I really call you superior, but it basically means you're above average. If you're in the range of 130 to 145, that's considered like the gifted range. I don't know if they really have a gifted program nowadays. They did when I was a kid. I was a part of it. But it means you're much smarter than average, okay? That's what it's supposed to mean. Nowadays, they might call it honors or something like that. I don't know if the honors program is the same thing. If you're 145 or higher, that's called the genius range, okay? If you agree with these labels, but using labels in general is controversial. If your IQ is below 85, 70 to 85, you're a slow learner. If you, it basically means, you're probably going to end up in special ed, okay? 55 to 70, you're considered having a mild intellectual disability. You're also going to be in special ed, but you're going to be in the more moderate, to severe range. Not really moderate to severe, but it means you're in special ed. Okay, you have intellectual difficulties according to this. If you're in the bottom, like kind of 0.14, IQ of 55 or less, moderate to severe disability. That means you're moderate, you're kind of in the middle, you're more extreme. Mild is 55 to 70, to use the labels here correctly. And this is the bell curve. This is the way scores distribute themselves, okay? The labels are a bit controversial here. I do want to point out, though, that whenever you give a bunch of people any tests, whether it's a psychology test, a math test, a memory test, whatever it is, you will almost always get a curve that looks like this, where most people will score somewhere in the middle, whatever the average happens to be, and then some people will score higher, and as you go higher and higher, there will be less people that score that high, even if it's an SAT test or something like that, right? And there'll be some people who score below average. And then the further you get away from the average on the low end, the less people score that low. So scores almost always distribute themselves this way. You get a bell-shaped distribution. What's controversial about this are the labels, of course, labeling people according to this way. And in the past, by the way, the labels were a lot less politically correct, to put it that way. Okay, I don't know if some of you guys remember the R word, to refer to people who are kind of intellectually disabled or who are slower than average. But it's not appropriate to use that word anymore, okay? But they used to use that, okay? And then, of course, teenagers and kids, mostly teenagers, started calling each other that to basically belittle each other and to make fun of each other. and then they had to change the label because it became something that's just thrown around as something bad, when it really means, you know, used to mean that there's some kind of disability. But still a very bad way to refer to people, if you know what I'm talking about. But that's the the bell-shaped curve. It talks about the distribution of scores. Okay. Here's the thing, though. You have to consider if the test is even appropriate, though, let's say, for everyone. Okay. Because you have to think about, what do IQ tests really measure? Okay. Do they really measure, you know, intelligence? Are they measuring cultural knowledge? Are they measuring what you're supposed to have learned in school? What do they really measure? So they've been criticized for that. I'll give you an example. If you're a kid who grew up as a part of another culture, you know, some other part of the country other than, let's say, the US, and they give you one of these IQ tests, you're probably not going to score in the average range or higher than that. You're going to score in the low range. Does that really mean you're slow or you're intellectually disabled? Probably not. You're a member of a different culture. There's different cultural knowledge, different things that are emphasized, and you wouldn't score as well. The test is most appropriate for basically Americans, and to tell you the truth, it's middle to upper class white Americans. That's who the test is most appropriate for. Okay. And I could go into examples of that, of questions that are on the test, but we don't really have time for all of that to take a really close look at that. But I will talk a little bit more about the controversy surrounding these tests. Let's talk about these tests in general. What tests aim to kind of measure IQ? The first English version of an IQ test is the Stanford Binet test. Okay, first English version. The first test was developed in France. It was called the Stanford Theophile test, and they're the ones who came up with the term IQ, and it was meant for basically, you know, people in France. And whenever people do make tests, you know, it's never meant for the disadvantaged, by the way. It's never meant for the poor. It's always meant for those who are doing relatively okay, middle to upper class, you know, and members of the so-called dominant culture, okay, or the majority. But it was originally developed in France, and then developed an English version. The English version is called the Stanford Binet test. And it's basically where they get the term intelligence quotient. It was used for this test. Your IQ stands for intelligent quotient, which, like I said, compared the child's chronological age, the real age, with the child's mental age. Okay, and it multiplied it times 100 to give you your IQ. Initially, that's the way they did it. They don't do it that way anymore. Now they just compare your scores along a graph, and they determine your you know, where you fall, and that's how they give you a number for your IQ. They do the same thing, by the way, for SAT tests, GRE tests, any kind of standardized tests. They give the test to a bunch of people. They see where the average is, and then depending on whether you score near or above the average, they determine what your score is. If you're well above average, they will give you a score that's a good score, a high score. If you're below average, they will give you a low score. If you're somewhere in the middle, they'll give you a middle score. And that's the way they always determine how to give you a score on these tests now, even if it's an IQ test. But for the IQ test, the average is supposed to be 100. That's just the way the test is defined, okay? At least for the Stanford Binet test and the Stanford Theophile test. The test was criticized as being basically culturally biased, right? Biased against minorities, against people who are disadvantaged. It's been criticized for decades for those reasons. There are other tests that came along that try to basically do a little bit of better job of being less biased, okay? The Wechsler tests are a little bit more modern. They test vocabulary, general knowledge, memory, spatial comprehension, and there's different versions of it. There's the WPPSI, the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence. Okay, the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, that's the one meant for adults, and the WIS, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. So different versions of the tests for people of different age. Okay. I've looked specifically at the tests and I've compared them, and the Wechsler test has different kinds of questions, some more visual stuff. I would say it's probably a little bit more fair than the Stanford Binet test, a little bit less culturally biased. But I will tell you this right off the bat, that it's just impossible to create a test that's not culturally biased. The person who creates the test, or the people who create the test, can only ask about things that they know, things that are a part of their culture. And it's impossible to get away from that bias, okay? IQ tests, however, have been shown to be good predictors of school achievement and adult career attainment. Yes, if you're a member of this culture, right, American culture, the IQ test, is supposed to indicate that you're doing well, okay? That you're doing well in school, and that you're doing well as a member of this culture, right? You're understanding things and you are learning things, and it predicts that you would do well in school and have a good career, because after all, it does measure what you're supposed to know as a member of this culture. But just because if you score low, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not intelligent. It's been criticized for being culturally biased, like I said. So here's the thing, I always get ahead of myself, but it says here that IQ tests have been criticized for being culturally biased and for not assessing other aspects of intelligence. Okay. Yeah, they're not appropriate for everybody. Okay, it just depends on your culture. It will underestimate your score if you're a member of a different culture, or if you're disadvantaged, economic disadvantage, an ethnic minority, or something like that. It will even, by the way, you're even disadvantaged if you're female. Okay, the test makers and the people who make the test, the researchers, are almost always male, and there is a bit of a male bias there. It does underestimate the scores of females, I would say. The questions are a bit geared toward males. Males would score. Research shows that males do score a little bit better. Does that mean that males are smarter? I don't really think so. I think that it's just a bit more male biased. And we'll talk about those scores and what's happening with those scores, by the way, the different sex differences and whether they really exist, okay? Or if it's just something has to do with the test. And they've also been criticized for leaving things out, that IQ tests only often measure one kind of intelligence. Your IQ, for instance, is supposed to measure your general intelligence, how intelligent you are, as if intelligence was only one thing. Other researchers came along and they suggested that intelligence is not that simple. For instance, Robert Sternberg, whose picture you see at the top right there, proposed the test in 1996. And he distinguished between three different types of intelligence. He says there's three different kinds. It's not one thing. It's not just this thing that they call G, general intelligence. There's actually three different kinds, okay? There's academic intelligence, which is what is measured in school, by the way. That's what you get from school. That's what you learn in school. That's what this achievement test measure, and probably what the IQ test measures as well. It measures academic stuff, okay? Another way to think about that is book smarts, okay? That's academic intelligence. These intelligence tests, these previous ones, don't measure creative intelligence. Like those people, those people who are creative, are musical, or they know how to dance, they know how to put on a show, or let's say they are, let's say, very good at drawing or sculpting or things like that. Those would be people who have creative intelligence. That is not measured on those traditional IQ tests. And then there's people with practical intelligence, people who just know how to get things done in the real world, okay? People who know how to work with others, let's say, or who know how to run a business, or just know how to survive in the real world, okay? Practical intelligence would be basically street smarts, okay? How good are your street smarts, right? If they put you out in the middle of nowhere in some frozen tundra somewhere, would you be able to survive? Probably not, because you don't have that kind of practical intelligence. By the way, being poor and growing up in a very disadvantaged environment around crime and drugs and things like that, being able to navigate that very well and still being able to survive, and not just survive, but succeed, involves practical intelligence. It's a very different situation than growing up in a nice neighborhood, okay? So you need more practical intelligence for that, okay? So practical intelligence is also called street smarts. Creative intelligence, I forget what the other term for it is, but it's those people who are creative. But there's another term for it that they use that's more the vernacular, the more the common way of referring to it, like street smarts, right? Book smarts. I forget what the one for creative is, but you understand what I mean. According to Sternberg, there's three kinds of intelligence. Okay, and his test would basically look at three, right? These three different kinds, whereas the other test only looked at one, okay, which is academic. Howard Gardner went even further. He said that there's actually 8 different types of intelligence. He said 8, and then later on he added one. There's actually 9, okay? but I'm keeping it as 8 because the book mentions 8, so I don't want to confuse you guys, but there's actually 9, okay? He added 1 later on, okay? But he said there's actually 8 different kinds of intelligence. There's linguistic intelligence, and those people who are good at language, good at reading and writing, right? That kind of stuff, comprehension, right? There's also logical mathematical intelligence. There are those people who are good at basically math and logic. There's people who are musical, people who have spatial intelligence. Spatial intelligence are those who are able to visualize things in their mind, objects, and the orientation and stuff like that. For instance, a pilot would need to have good spatial intelligence. There are those who have bodily kinesthetic intelligence. That's intelligence has to do with your body and how you move it. Athletes, for instance, have really good bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Can you do what those athletes do, right? Can you weave your way through the crowd as a football player, right, and avoid getting tackled? Can you twist your body the way a gymnast does, right? Can you move the way a basketball player does to be able to basically make that basket while other people are trying to stop you, right? That's bodily kinesthetic intelligence. According to Gardner, there's no such thing as a dumb jock, right? Athletes are intelligent in a different way. By the way, and it's a stereotype that athletes are not intelligent in other ways, right? There's plenty of athletes who are intelligent in many ways, okay? But if you have an athlete, they at least have this kind of intelligence. There's interpersonal intelligence. Interpersonal intelligence are people who basically know how to work with others. Inter means between. These are people who would be good at business. They know how to understand people. They know how to work with people. Intrapersonal intelligence are people who are in tune with themselves. Intra means within. Those would be your psychologists, your counselors, the people who understand how other people feel or how other people behave or why they behave that way, why they think and feel the way they do, right? Intra means within, people who understand people from the inside, so to speak. That's psychology related, okay? And there's naturalistic intelligence. Those are people who basically are intelligent out there in the natural world, like Charles Darwin, right? Where he went on that voyage in the Beagle and wound up at the Galapagos Islands, was looking at all the birds, noticed different types of beaks and stuff like that, and reasoned that there must be a reason for that, and that I proposed this theory of evolution. It doesn't have to be like Darwin. You know, you could go out there in the natural world and you might be good, for instance, at determining if an animal has been there, you know, how to read tracks or how to read the landscape and be able to figure out where an animal might be hiding, right? Or how to stay safe out there. You know, or maybe to figure things out about the trees, like, you know, the trees are all kind of leaning in a certain way, which indicates that place gets a lot of wind in a certain direction. And that's why they lean that way. Naturalistic kind of intelligence. Okay. There was another one that Gardner added later. It has to do with a philosophical kind of intelligence. I haven't seen it in a while. Can't remember what it's called. But yeah, he did propose another one later on, which had to do with more like, you know, philosophical types of things, a philosophical kind of intelligence, but I forget the name of it. Anyway, I'm not going to struggle to remember the name of it. Your book only mentions these 8, so we'll stick to these 8. Daniel Goleman came along and said that there's still something missing, that that intelligence tests often neglect to mention and measure something called emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to regulate your emotions and relate well to others. Okay. You know, IQ tests, for instance, or, you know, achievement tests, these tests basically usually just measure academic intelligence. You know, that's what Sternberg called it. But emotional intelligence is something that is almost never measured, okay? Let me give you an example. A kid who's very good at school, does really well at school, right? Would probably score high on those achievement tests, probably score high on those IQ tests, but may not score very high on emotional intelligence. Just to give you an example, your stereotypical nerd, for instance, might be very good at school, right? Very good at that stuff, but has difficulty relating to others, making friends, difficulty, you know, as a teenager, let's say, or as an adult, getting a girlfriend, finding someone to date, because they are underdeveloped emotionally. They focus so much on school and intellectual matters that they neglect that other aspect of themselves. So they lack emotional intelligence. they lack the ability to relate well to others. And that would be your stereotypical nerd. But by the way, that is a stereotype. Just because you're smart and do well at school and do well on these tests doesn't mean you don't have emotional intelligence. There are plenty of people who do, but the stereotypes, the stereotypes, those that just are very good at school and very bright or whatever it is, but they don't have a clue about how to, for instance, get a date or how to make friends and things like that. That would be, those lacking emotional intelligence. So just other ways to think about intelligence, okay, that you should be aware of. This is biological development in middle childhood, so we do need to talk a bit about the brain. What do brain scans say about intelligence and achievement and things like that? So one way to look at aptitude, right, is to measure the brain directly, okay? So you can look at the brain through these brain scans, these, fMRIs, or, CAT scans. There's different kinds. There's the fMRI, there's the CAT scans, there's the, there's different kinds, okay? Can't remember all of them right now. But when they look at the brain, right, in these big machines, right, where they scan the brain, right, the brain scans don't necessarily correlate with these IQ tests in childhood. So just because, let's say, you're doing well in one area or you're doing well, doesn't mean that they see anything different in your brain, okay? When they scan your brain. But by adolescence, they do see some differences. They do see that basically certain parts of the brain are more active when you tend to do well in, on some types of tests, okay? That there is a correlation there, but it's just a correlation, okay? That's what these things tell you, okay? There's a correlation, that there seems to be more activity in this part of the brain when a person does this kind of task, for instance. Localized brain hubs and lobes suggest multiple intelligence. That suggests that, yeah, there's different parts of the brain that are good at different things, and therefore different parts of the brain would light up, so to speak, or be more active when they look at them in these brain scans, right? When you do different kinds of things, that suggests multiple intelligence. Speed of reaction seems to be characteristics of the entire brain, right? The quicker you are on your feet, the quicker you can think and solve problems and things like that. That may underlie what's called G. G is not defined for you there, but I did mention it. It just was never written down, but G stands for general intelligence. So your general intelligence might have more to do with your ability to solve problems, to think quickly, that kind of stuff, right? And to solve problems quickly, right? That would be your speed of reaction. It has to do with how quick you are at figuring things out. There's a lot of variation in children's brains, okay? And it makes experts hesitant to argue for one interpretation of IQ tests and brain scans. Experts are very hesitant, don't necessarily want to say that this is, basically evidence for this theory or that theory, because it's a very controversial thing. And remember, when you look at a brain scan and you're trying to somehow relate that to some kind of, some kind of activity or some type of intelligence or something like that, that it's only a correlation. There's no cause and effect going on here. It's just a correlation. You're just trying to relate the two. There is neurodiversity, okay? Each person has neurological strengths and weaknesses. We all have strengths and weaknesses. We're all different, and our brains are all different, okay? So each person is different, even in the brain, okay? And this neurodiversity seems to be particularly relevant for children with like disorders, like for instance, those on the autism spectrum. You guys may have heard that, for instance, that children on the autism spectrum might struggle on some types of tasks, but excel at others. For instance, there are children on the autism spectrum who might not be very good, let's say, at reading and writing and that kind of stuff. They're really behind, and then maybe they would be special ed, but they seem to excel in math. Others might excel in, let's say, in music or in, some other kind of art like drawing, okay? Or some actually might excel even in things that have to do with language. And by language, I don't necessarily mean speaking, because these children don't really like to speak to others, don't really like to interact so much with others. But there are children on the autism spectrum who love to read and are very good at that stuff. They seem to have that particular strength, although they don't want to tell you about it and discuss it with you because they're on the autism spectrum. We're going to talk about these learning disabilities in a moment, okay? And so you know what we mean, okay? So there are children with special needs, and this will get us to these disabilities. okay? Special needs in middle childhood. So developmental psychopathology is relevant in middle childhood, right? There are children who have difficulties, who have, you know, certain kind of impairments, okay? Age grouping and scheduling learning, scheduled learning reveal peer differences. What that means is when kids go to school, they're usually with other kids who are their age, and, you know, in classrooms with kids who are, you know, who are of similar age. And there you can really see if some kids are struggling, that are, let's say they're behind where most of the kids are, might indicate that the kid has some kind of problem that we'll talk about. Some disorders, some problems can be mitigated with early and targeted treatment. It's best to, you know, figure out if there's a problem early and to get to it early and, you know, have some targeted treatment early. Your child will be much better off down the road than if you wait until later on. If you suspect there's a problem, please get your child tested. But there's also caution when it comes to diagnosis and treatment. There's also caution, right? Labeling kids a certain way, you know, indicating that they have a certain problem, right? Indicate it's also labeling, and can actually harm kids psychologically and socially. We'll talk about that. And the treatment may not be appropriate. Kids can be misdiagnosed, and they might be given a certain treatment that it's not actually what they need. You need to remember multi-finality and equifinality, terms we talked about early in the semester. Multi-finality means that one cause can have many final manifestations. So one problem, let's say in the brain, one difficulty can turn into different things, you know, that you might see. So a certain problem in one part of the brain might indicate one type of problem for one child, a different kind of problem for another. That's multi-finality, okay? Equifinality means that one symptom can have many causes. Autism is probably not due to one thing, but actually many things, okay? There's a whole spectrum. There's different kinds that probably have different causes. So it's complicated, is the point of this, okay? And so it's hard to diagnose children with this stuff, and also hard to treat them. Let's talk about these specific learning disorders, okay? The DSM-5, we're on the DSM-5R now. The DSM-5 stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. DSM-5 basically diagnoses of specific learning disorders, right? The way it does that is that it indicates that there might be a problem if there's a disability in both perception and processing of information. There might be a problem with the way the children perceives the information. Might see, for instance, the letters or numbers reversed, indicating some kind of problem, or processing of the information. Maybe the child doesn't understand the information, can't process the information in the right way, okay? Usually results in lower achievement than expected in reading, so they're not as good at reading, they're behind, for instance, lower achievement in math, writing, maybe even spelling, right? That might indicate there's a learning disability. So the DSM looks at things like that. Disabilities, by the way, in these areas, undercut academic achievement. Your kid won't be doing as well in school as they could because they have this learning disability. They also destroy self-esteem, okay? At this time, you know, in middle childhood, most children, if they do have a learning disability, by this time they are probably aware of it, and they know they're different, and that actually harms their self-esteem. They might understand that they're different, or might think that they're actually, you know, unintelligent or dumb or whatever it is, and they feel, a lot of them really feel bad about themselves. But it depends on the child. My son is 7 years old. He's going to be 8. He's on the autism spectrum. Because he's on the autism spectrum and he doesn't perceive things socially the way the rest of us do, he doesn't really understand yet that there's anything wrong with him. So it hasn't affected his self-esteem yet, but eventually he will know that he's different, and that will affect how he feels about himself. And that's just what happens with these learning disabilities. And they're really bad for kids' self-esteem. This labeling is bad for kids' self-esteem in general. And they qualify a child for special education. When your child does have a learning disability, many times it means that you know, they can be in a different classroom with children like them who also have disabilities, okay? And you have rights as a parent, whether you want your kid in special ed or you want them in a regular classroom and stuff like that. But that's something that you have to discuss with the teachers and the psychologist and, and the administrators at the school. And it's just something that requires a team effort to figure out what's the best way to approach it, right? When a kid has a learning disability, what's the best way to mitigate that to help that child? Here's some specific, disabilities, learning disabilities. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. We've all heard of this. It used to be called ADD in the past, attention deficit disorder, but now it's called ADHD because it's usually not just attention deficit. It usually has hyperactivity in there as well. So it's called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These children have difficulty concentrating for more than a few moments, okay? Attention deficit, they can't maintain attention for very long. So they tend to be inattentive, right? They can't really pay attention for very long, which means that it's harder for them to learn. They also tend to be impulsive. That's the hyperactive part, right? Impulsive, overactive. They have trouble sitting still, right? So, they're hyperactive. It's hard for them to sit still in the classroom, right? They drive their teachers crazy. They want to get up and run around and do things, okay? They're hyperactive, okay? Children in general are more active than adults, right? More impulsive, more overactive, but this is more of an extreme, okay? Where just children, can't sit still for very long at all. According to the DSM-5, the symptoms must start before age 12, okay, for it to be considered ADHD. It's usually diagnosed in children. There are teenagers or even adults that have ADHD, but for the most part, people outgrow this. It's more typical in childhood. The new definition of ADHD includes more people with an incidence increase. The new way they define ADHD makes it so a lot more children qualify as having ADHD. A lot more children are labeled with ADHD. A whole lot more than in the past. Are we just better at diagnosing it, or are we just labeling too many kids as having ADHD, misdiagnosing a lot of kids? Because it's just, there's way too many kids that qualify as having ADHD. Do they all really have ADHD, or are we doing too much labeling here? There is some controversy about that, but it's a real problem, okay? By the way, I want to point out that the children that do have real ADHD have an understimulated prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that allows you to pay attention, to focus, to control yourself, control your emotions. And you can see how this relates, very well to ADHD. Okay, understimulation there of the prefrontal cortex. More about this. So there is increases in worldwide diagnosis for ADHD. A lot more kids being diagnosed as having ADHD, and that is worrisome, right? Are we overdoing it with the diagnosis? Are we labeling kids too much? Is it really that many kids that have ADHD, or are we just seeing normal childish behavior as being ADHD, right? There's a lot of misdiagnosis. The child may have another disorder, not ADHD. Maybe the child is just acting up because the child has, some kind of problems at home, or the child, let's say, is, it has other difficulties. The child may be being abused, and maybe the child is difficult for those reasons, or the child is traumatized, or bad parenting, whatever it is, right? There could be a lot of misdiagnosis. It could also be, drug use, right? There are some kids who actually want to be diagnosed as having ADHD so they can obtain those drugs legally. They are given amphetamines for treatment. Those have ADHD. Ritalin is one of those treatments for ADHD, but there's others. There's one like Adderall, which is a drug that is frequently abused, by teenagers. So there are some that may act like they have ADHD so they can get the drug. And the drug helps them focus and improves their memory. And there are, I know we're talking about middle childhood here, but there are people in college, in high school, and in junior high who take Adderall and other drugs to give them an edge in school, to help them focus, to help them, to help them do better, because that's what the drugs are designed to do, because these children have ADHD, can't really focus. So there is abuse of the drugs, and some will pretend to have ADHD so they can get the drugs. Not sure that, how much that is happening in middle childhood, but it's still an issue with drug use, okay? Normal behavior can be considered pathological. Children are normally active and impulsive. That's just the way children are. And some children can be labeled as having ADHD when in fact they are not. They don't have ADHD. Okay. Children are just, they have shorter attention spans and they find it harder to control themselves. Okay. But there are real cases of ADHD, many of them. But a lot of children are misdiagnosed. More about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Treatment for ADHD could include, let's say, training for the family and the child. It is difficult to raise a child that has ADHD. So yeah, you do need some, some training on how to handle children like these because they will drive you crazy. Okay, and if you don't handle these children correctly, they can grow up to have other more serious problems down the road. Okay, so there is some therapy that involves basically parental training and also with the child as well. That could help. Okay, but there's also special education for teachers, teaching teachers to handle these kind of children. There's of course medication, which is often what's done. Put the children on medication, whether it's Ritalin, Adderall, or some other drug. That's usually what happens. A lot of parents don't want their kids on medication. They refuse that, so they might need to handle it a different way, right? They might need training on, okay, well, how do you handle this child, right? When the child does this or that, or how's the teacher supposed to handle the child? There's a whole bunch of things that goes into treatment, okay? Remember, as equifinality suggests, disorders may vary in causes, okay? There might be many things that could be leading to these symptoms that you see as ADHD. And also, there's no single treatment that works for every child. Some drugs work on some children, not others, right? The special ed is sometimes useful for some, but not others, right? For some kids, if they are put in special ed, or the way the teachers handle them, right, or the family, right? Children are different, and they don't all respond in appropriate ways or in positive ways. So the treatment has to be tailored to the individual needs of the child. It's just a very complicated thing. Human beings in general are just complex individuals, okay? And when you have a disorder, a learning disorder, or some other disorder, it's just something that's difficult to deal with in general, okay? Because the human beings are so complex, even children. There's also autism spectrum disorder, which I mentioned, okay? Children with autism spectrum disorder have problems with social communication, right? They basically often will not talk much, okay? Sometimes they can talk, but they just don't. Often they have speech problems and they can't speak correctly, and they might require speech therapy. Like my son does get speech therapy. He can't pronounce a lot of the words and sounds correctly. He's getting better. He's been going to speech therapy for years now. He's gotten a lot better. But yeah, there are impairments there with that communication with speech. Some children just refuse to speak, or they'll speak much later than they should. And you might think there's something wrong with them, that they can't talk, or when they do talk, they don't really pronounce things correctly. There's also problems with social interaction, difficulty seeing things from some other person's point of view. They have difficulty basically in general interacting with others. They may not take much of an interest in others, form normal friendships, may not really attend to what other people are saying. So they tend to not do very well in school because the teacher is giving the lesson or guiding the kids on this type of instruction, that kind of instruction. And for them, it's like, they're not even getting at that, right? They're not, they're not catching that, so to speak. It's in one ear and kind of out the other. Some of them are actually lost in space, and it's like they're not there mentally. For others, I mean, they're there, but they just, they're socially impaired. They're not really getting all the information that they should. A lot of it is tuned out, or they're just not as attentive as they should be. They really have a problem interacting socially with others. And that makes learning very, very difficult, just so you know, and it makes the teacher's job very difficult. Or you as a parent, your job very difficult to get this child to do what the child's supposed to do, to get this child to read properly, to write things properly, to teach this child math. That's all social interaction. And it makes it very hard when they have problems with social interaction. When mentally they don't take much of an interest, they're not really there mentally, or it's just harder to get them to focus. Restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior as well, interest and activities. So there's certain things that they do over and over again. They might prefer to read the same book, listen to the same song or do the same thing. Maybe they just want to ride their bike all day long, or they want to play video games all the time. Now, there are kids who are like that, who show repetitive patterns, but these children are a bit more extreme, okay? They like to do things over and over again. My son, for instance, plays Goat Simulator, a game on his iPad, over and over again. He likes to pretend he's a goat and wander around there headbutting people. He likes to wear green all the time. He has a very unhealthy obsession with his sister. His sister has to give him attention or he throws a fit. If she says that somebody else is cute or she's nice to somebody else, he gets upset and jealous. This repetitive behavior, right? Where it's just these obsessions are very common in these children. And it's not just one, it could be many, okay? And different children have different obsessions, different restricted, repetitive behaviors, okay? Autism spectrum disorder was formerly reserved for children who were mute or violent. In the past, children who couldn't talk were labeled as having autism, right? Or those who were violent. Not so, it's a very different thing, okay? Now there's different, there's levels of severity. There's mild, moderate, or severe categories. So there's like level 1, level 2, level 3. That's what that stands for. My son is level 1. He's mild. He does pay attention. You can talk to him. He is there, but he has the other problems with the repetitive behavior. He doesn't get as much as he could from interaction, especially at school with the teacher. Sometimes I wonder if he's even learning anything at school because he's there, he's in special ed. And according to his teacher, he doesn't do much, but you can engage him. You can play with him and, things that he likes and, and he will do things. He will engage with people, but it's just harder for him to do so. He is impaired, but he's mild. Hopefully he'll be much better in the future. But, well, children turn out different ways. More about autism spectrum disorder. Well, what is it? What percentage of kids have autism, or what are the odds of having a child with autism? 1 in blank, question mark. Last I heard, it's about 1 in 70. About 1 out of every 70 children might qualify as having autism spectrum disorder. Okay. I am old enough to remember when I started teaching, like 15 years ago. I remember when it used to be like basically 1 in 1,000. And I remember it got down to 1 in 500, 1 in 200, 1 in 100, 1 in 90. Last I heard, it's about 1 in 70. What is happening? Are more children really developing autism, or are we just getting better at recognizing these problems and basically more children are being diagnosed with it? Boys are 3 times more likely, okay, than girls to have autism. Okay, might indicate there might be some sex-linked genetic thing going on. Okay, causes, well, there could be many things. Okay, probably some genetics going on there, right? So there could be some teratogens that are affecting children prenatally, right? Because they do seem to have this impairment right from the beginning. Okay, you notice when you have a kid with autism that they're not the same as normal children. Right from the beginning, you notice that something is off, right? They don't seem to cry as much. Okay, they are a little bit more quiet, and you may not notice as a parent right at the beginning, but by the time your child gets a little bit older, you'll start realizing that your child isn't normal. But there are signs there from the very beginning, indicates that there's something genetic going on, something biological. It could be something genetic. It might actually be something else that's affecting the child's development prenatally. There's no support, by the way, that immunizations have anything to do with it. Okay, it's not immunizations, because the patterns are already there before the child even gets any immunizations, by the way. There's already, though, you can already see those things, that there's some impairment there. Immunizations aren't really doing anything. Okay, there's other forms of autism. It used to be called just autism. Now it's autism spectrum disorder because there's different kinds. Okay, they're not all the same, these children that on the autism spectrum. Okay, Asperger's syndrome, for instance, is a certain kind of type of autism that's considered high functioning autism, where children have less severe symptoms of autism. They can have normal speech, normal intelligence, but severely impaired social interaction. There are kids, and my wife has had some of these, in her classes. My wife is an English teacher. There are kids that she's had, for instance, who are very smart, you know, and they love to read and they just read all the time. The problem is they don't want to do anything else. They can talk and they have to seem to be normal intelligence or even quite intelligent, but they just want to sit there and read and not talk to anybody. They don't want to listen to what the teacher says. They don't do what the teacher says. So they end up failing the class anyway, because they don't interact. They don't do what they're supposed to do. They just want to sit there and read, okay? There are some that are quite intelligent, but they don't respond normally to others. That's the problem. And if you're going to do well in school, well in life in general, you have to interact with others. You have to work with others. And that's a problem with those that have Asperger's. Remember that there are levels of severity, right? There are some that are severe, moderate, or mild, right? There are some that are mild and can still function quite normally, right? So those with Asperger's symptoms will have problems with, say, communication. They can speak, but they'll choose not to, for instance. Social skills, they don't really relate well to others. They want to deal with others, right? Imaginative play, pretend play, they don't really do that. In general, those with autism tend to develop pretend play later than they should, okay? It takes them longer to be able to play in that way. And that's part of social, it's not really social interaction, but they're imagining other things, okay, and other people, and that imagination takes them, imaginative play, it takes them a bit longer to develop that. There's other specific learning disorders that I'll mention more briefly. There is dyslexia, which all of you have probably heard of. These are children or people who have dyslexia in general, have unusual difficulty with reading. They have a hard time reading, okay? It's thought to be the result of some neurological impairment. There might be something wrong in the brain. But people with dyslexia don't see the words, the letters, the way normal kids do. They may see them as upside down or reversed, and they have difficulty reading. You know, there is treatment for that. It can be corrected. They can get a lot better, but they seem to have some problem processing the information. And I'm beginning to think that maybe my son has a bit of that too. Here's the thing, when a child has one disorder, they usually have other problems as well. My son is on the autism spectrum. He's also a very anxious boy. I think he also has, you know, social anxiety. Okay, and he might even have some dyslexia, because I've noticed when it comes to trying to help him out, you know, read and write and help him write certain things, and he has trouble writing things. Sometimes he writes them upside down, reverse. Might indicate some dyslexia. But yes, he is, you know, learn his letters, the sound stuff, that starts to learn how to read, know some simple words and stuff. But he's behind. Okay, in math, he's very far behind. Dyscalculia, by the way, is unusual difficulty with math. These children have a lot of difficulty with math, those that have dyscalculia. Probably originating from some distinct part of the brain. Might be something neurological as well, okay? It's often comorbid with dyslexia. My son also seems to be very bad at math. You know, he knows his numbers, he knows what they mean. I'm trying to teach him how to add, how to subtract, and it's really hard, okay? Because, you know, it's just, I can teach him, showing them, you know, stuffed animals or blocks, stuff like that. But I mean, the kid just gets so distracted, you know, and he doesn't even follow what I'm trying to tell him. He seems to have this kind of mental block or this inability to think about that thing and imagine what we're trying to do. You have to be able to imagine, right? This number stands for this many. And if we have this many, we take away this many, how many do we have left? He has trouble with all that, just understanding that, just imagine, because it's a problem with social interaction children with autism have. But dyscalculia means generally you're really bad at math. It doesn't mean you have autism, but my son seems to, you know, be bad at math. It doesn't mean he has dyscalculia, but children that have autism or have other learning disabilities will often be behind in many areas. Dysgraphia is unusual difficulty with spelling and writing, okay? They misspell things very often. They have trouble writing. Might be, you know, a neurological problem as well. My son has problems with his fine motor skills in general. Tracing the letters and stuff like that. It's hard for him to do the letter really well, trace it properly, let alone draw it without any, you know, just without anything, any little dots that he has to trace. But he's getting better, and it's just, you know, you need treatment and targeted treatment, okay? Labels, laws, and learning. Okay, so how do you deal with these kids, right? Do you provide them with the least restrictive environment, which is when you put the child in a regular class, right? The least restrictive environment just means that if possible, you want the child to be educated in a normal school with normal kids in a normal classroom. That's what I want for my child. I don't want him to be in a special school, okay? In a special class, you know, in a different school other than where his sister goes. I want him to feel normal as possible. But he is in special ed, so he's not in the least restrictive environment, but I think that's what he needs. He, in a regular classroom, he would just, he wouldn't do well. Okay, he would be failing miserably. Okay, not that they give Fs in elementary school, but they have a numbering system now. My son's not even doing well, not even in special ed. He's behind. I think he's actually, his intelligence, I think it's normal. It's the problem is his autism. Okay, the problem is the social interaction. The fact that he doesn't get it, he doesn't really imagine what he's supposed to imagine. He doesn't interact. He's not there mentally. Okay, but he does understand. Okay, if somehow you can get to him. Okay, there's also response to intervention where children receive special intervention in a regular classroom. They might be educated in a regular classroom, and for instance, the teacher has some special activities for this child, for instance, to help them, you know, do their work, or someone who deals specifically with this child. Okay, that's response to intervention. An individual education plan is a document that specifies the educational goals and plans for the child with special needs. If you have a kid with special needs in school, you'll have to deal with this when your kid's going to school. Doesn't matter where it's elementary, junior high, or high school. If the child with special needs will have an IAP plan, right? It's a document that says, and you have a meeting with basically the school psychologist, the teacher, the parents are involved. Sometimes the kid is there, but doesn't really have to be. Administrators, and you talk about your child's needs and what are the goals? What do we want this kid to be able to do by the end of the year? And how are we going to get there? And there's this plan. It's an individual education plan. Other labels here, other things, a little bit of history here. Before 1960, most children were with special needs were put in what was called special ed. And it's still around, okay? And my kid is in special ed. Right, but special ed means they're taught in a separate classroom. Research has shown in the past that it's not very good for kids to be in special ed. It slows their development. It slows the development of their normal social skills because they're with other kids who are impaired as well. And they don't necessarily get to interact as much with kids who are normal, who have normal social skills. So they fall behind when it comes to their social skills. And they also fall behind in other areas, right? There's not as much advancement in areas where the child is not disabled. So maybe the child has problems, let's say, with one particular skill, but they also have problems with others because they're not getting, you know, the type of education that they should in that special ed. Special ed has been criticized for basically just being a waste of time where children don't really learn much of anything. And it really just has a lot to do with the fact that the kids' individual needs are not being met. If you want your child to have the best education, you need basically someone to deal with your kid individually. That's what these kids need. Their own teacher, one-on-one, or an aide. The problem is, even when they do have their own aide, the aide is often not someone who's highly trained, but it's best if you can afford it, right? That your child, in any kind of situation, whether your child is behind, brilliant, or whatever it is, the best situation is always that you have a one-on-one teacher for your child. And that's what the rich people do. You know, they have some very bright, very highly educated person teach their child, okay? One-on-one education. Of course, we can't afford that with public education. So your kid is put in special ed with other kids that are special ed, with a teacher and several aides, and they usually suffer and fall behind, okay, even more. Often doesn't do much for them. After 1975, they do have still special ed nowadays, by the way. Just want to point that out. It's not gone, okay? After 1975, they advocated other things like mainstreaming, that maybe the kids need to be taught in a regular classroom, right? The teacher had to use alternative methods, right? Other methods to try to reach these children, try to help these children, right? Allow them more time to complete their work because maybe they just need more time, right? It takes them a little bit, you know, a little bit longer for them to kind of catch up and do their work. There's also a resource room where children spend part of their day with a specially trained teacher, right? Where a teacher comes in and basically takes, little Johnny to another class. And then that teacher is a specially trained teacher who will teach that child one-on-one. It undermines social relationships. It causes problems with other kids notice that Johnny is going off with his teacher, and that probably means that Johnny is not normal. And kids figure out after a while, that Johnny is impaired in some way, and they treat the kid differently. So their social relationships suffer. Inclusion is where the kid is taught in a regular classroom with the help of a specially trained teacher, what's called a paraprofessional. Para means besides, so someone else other than the teacher that deals specifically with this child. It's the best solution currently available. But schools can't always afford this. There's a lot of kids that qualify as special ed, and to have them all in a regular classroom with their own individual teacher, they can't afford that. Even my son right now, because of his autism and because he doesn't follow along and stuff, he has his own special aid. Not working right now, by the way, in Zoom, okay? It doesn't work virtually with remote learning, but when it was regular face-to-face, they got him his own individual aid to work with him, to help him follow along and help him do his work. The problem is that, these aides often don't have any special training. They're just like regular aides. It's not like they're, experts in, the child's disability or anything like that, or experts on the type of teaching tools that would help those child. So they're usually just regular aides, and it does help the child, but what is meant by this is, a specially trained teacher professional, right? Not necessarily an aide, but that costs a lot of money and they can't really afford that, okay? And even to get the child their own aid, they have to kind of apply to get additional funding from the government, right? So there, money is the problem often. What about children on the other end of the spectrum? What about children who are very gifted or talented? Children who seem to be far and above, beyond average, okay? Those that have, let's say, a high IQ, right? Maybe they're bored in the regular classroom, that they're way beyond that. Those that are talented in some way, maybe they're very musical, or maybe they're just very good at something, okay? Or they show some kind of divergent thinking. They're different in the way they think, but they're usually advanced in some way, okay? Or they're very creative, very artistic, right? What do you do with these kids? Each US state selects and educates these so-called gifted children or talented children in their own particular way. There's different programs, there's different things, and it leads to controversy. When I was growing up, we had the gifted program. I remember it started in junior high for us. I was in the gifted program. And then I went to high school, and then it wasn't there anymore. Nowadays, I know you guys have the honors program. I don't know if that's what they have in elementary schools or in junior high or whatever it is, but there's other programs. There's all kinds of other things. I've heard of the magnet program or this program. I mean, I don't know of all of them, but there's different ways in different schools, different states that basically that educators handle these children who are different, who are advanced, not behind, they are advanced. Okay, what do you do with them? Because normally, if you leave them in a regular classroom, they suffer, they're bored, they don't learn much, they're way ahead. They already know all that stuff. Okay, they're just way ahead. That's another controversy as well. And when they do get when they do get into these programs, the gifted program, the honors program, or whatever it is program, other parents complain, say, why is it my kid in there? Why are you treating this child special? That's not right. My kid needs to have access to those programs as well. And people do complain, and parents do complain, and parents have a lot of power. And then what usually ends up happening is they have to end up open the program to other people as well. Let other people into the honors program who may not qualify as honors, or into the gifted program, or whatever it is. And it's changed over the years. That's what happened. I remember, when I was younger, the gifted program was different than it is now, or the honors program. Even in the honors program over the last 10 years has kind of changed. It used to be more exclusive, where only certain kids could get in. Now a lot more kids to get in. And I remember, because I've taught honors in the past, even at the college, it used to be that when you taught an honors class, all the students were like really good. They all did their work. They all did great work. They basically all got A's. You've never had any problems. Nowadays, it's a bit more inclusive. There's more children there, and now, or more kids in there, more students. And even at the college level, we still get, students now who are problematic, who won't do their work. In other words, why are you in honors if you're not going to do your work? That kind of thing. Maybe they're smart, but they don't want to do their work. And that happens also at the lower levels, where there are kids who, are smart, but they're not necessarily well behaved or don't want to do their work. There's more problems now as we've opened it up for everybody, right? The student population has changed a little bit, and there's more complaining on the part of teachers that it's not what it used to be. It used to be better and stuff like that. But we do want to be more fair and let, other people in, who also take advantage of those programs. They may benefit from them. But it also means that there are some who are going to be in there and who are not going to succeed, okay? Because they may not belong there, is what I'm saying. But if you want your kids to have the advantages, maybe they should give it a shot. One more thing here, strategies. Okay, so certain things you can do with gifted and talented children, acceleration or intensive homeschooling. So they can be in accelerated classes that are beyond, maybe AP classes, honors classes, the gifted program, whatever it is. Those are accelerated strategies where they accelerate things, where they basically give the children more to learn, or more advanced, basically concepts and teaching. Okay, you could homeschool your kid if you want, but homeschooling is a little bit controversial. Not all parents are capable of homeschooling their children, by the way. I mean, how educated are you as a parent? Can you really do that? Most parents don't have the skills, the knowledge, the training, the education to be able to teach their own kids, right, in a regular, give them regular education, let alone accelerated education, right? But there are some parents who are highly trained, highly educated individuals, and who are better off educating their own kids if they have the time and the resources, and their kids will be better off than if they were in a normal school. They can be grouped in a special class. They can have, a class that's just honors or just gifted, right? Gifted teachers. There are teachers who are better able to handle these kids who are also very bright and I guess beyond average themselves, and who understand these kids' needs a bit more. But it's also a controversial thing. What do you do with children who are talented and gifted? If they're in public schools, for the most part, their talents, their gifts are being wasted. If you're rich and privileged, you can do a lot for these children. You can provide them the what they need. Speaking of that, just one little thing. I did have a chance when I was in junior high, I was in the gifted program, to attend a special school. And this special school was basically not for slow learners. It was the opposite. Well, I remember a teacher, told me about it, and he helped me fill out the application to get me a scholarship to go to a private school, basically, a private school. That would be better served, my needs, because I was one of these kids. But in the end, I decided not to go, and he got mad at me, right? Thought I should have gone, but I decided not to go because I was in junior high. I didn't want to be away from my friends. I didn't want to be away from my family. I was going to have to go to a boarding school, live somewhere else with other people, and basically attend a private school somewhere far away. And I remember looking at the rules, that there were rules about when you go to bed, when you wake up. And it was also a kind of religious school as well, where there was going to be worship hours and this and that. And I looked at it, I don't want to do all of this. It's like, this seems like it doesn't, I as a kid, I didn't understand. Okay. I probably would have been better off in there, but I didn't want to give up my freedoms, is what I'm saying. Give up my friends, give up my social life. Not that I had much of a social life, but I saw it as very rigid, is what I'm saying. But I had a chance to attend one of these private schools, one of these schools for those that are more advanced, which basically a school that rich people can afford to send their kids to. But I ended up not going to, and not doing that, and I ended up turning it down. And I remember my teacher the teacher who connected me with that, getting upset. He got very upset about it. But well, I'm here, teaching you guys now. That is where I'll stop. Okay, so I'll stop recording.